Dayna Martin is an author and peaceful parenting advocate, spreading the message of freedom and children's rights. Author of the books Radical Unschooling, A Revolution Has Begun, and Sexy Birth. She's been featured on the Dr. Phil Show, Nightline, 60 Minutes, The Jeff Probst Show, and most recently, ABC's hit show, Wife Swap. Her articles, videos, and TV appearances have helped thousands of families on their path to live with more freedom, peace, and joy. We hear words like rebellion and chalk it up to normalcy. But what if there was nothing to rebel against? What if we lived with the same respect for our children that we demand they have for us? What if we could recognize that punishments model injustice, and that through using power to control another person, we are teaching them to do the same? It is through loving, kindness, and understanding that children learn love and peace, and in turn will reflect this back on the world. Respecting children's rights and freedoms is a revolutionary approach to parenting and education. This is a parenting philosophy on the leading edge of new thought, yet it is rooted in instinctual wisdom. Our culture needs to realize that living with respect and freedom with our children is the most responsible way to create a peaceful world.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Try This at Home. This is Dayna Martin. I am coming to you live from Madison, New Hampshire, the tiny little town of Madison, New Hampshire, and we are getting more snow here. We're supposed to get about 8 inches of snow tonight, and we already have probably 2.5 to 3 feet on the ground. I just got back from Chicago. I flew out there this weekend to be a speaker at the In-Home Conference. It was a great experience. I had never been to that conference before, but I had heard a lot about it. I think it was in its 16th or 17th year, but it was an honor to speak there. And my sessions, I did 3 different sessions, and they were completely full, which is always nice as a speaker. And it was great to connect with so many people. It was a traditional homeschooling conference. So I was there speaking on unschooling, and I spoke about radical unschooling, and then I spoke about using your child's interest as the nucleus of their learning, which I'd love to share with you about more tonight. That was my favorite one. I had some great questions. What a good dynamic group I had. And then I did another session called From Control to Connection, talk about shifting from the traditional authoritarian paradigm to the partnership paradigm, which is the type of parenting that I promote. I have a lot to share with you tonight. I was going to go in one direction with the show, and then I decided I wanted to read some John Taylor Gatto to you a little bit later, because I think learning more about the history of public education is so essential when you're on this path to awareness about alternatives. But let me first start with parenting in the news. This was just released today on healthdaynews.com. I thought this was fascinating and not surprising to me anyway. Kids with demanding parents who are rigid about rules, stingy with affection, and won't discuss limits are far more likely to be obese than children whose parents practice a more balanced parenting style, new research suggests. Canadian scientists found that obesity rates were about 1/3 higher in children up to age 11 whose parents were using a so-called authoritarian parenting style, marked by inflexibility over rules and a lack of emotional responsiveness. In a group of more than 37,000 children, these kids were significantly heavier compared to those whose authoritative parents were generally affectionate, willing to discuss behavior limits and setting healthy boundaries. So what this tells me is just basically what I promote, and that's control causes a warped relationship with things such as food. And there's a lot of reasons why kids overindulge in such things, but I think reading further on, it says these findings are consistent with what's been found for other dimensions of children's health, that an authoritarian parenting style is not the best for children's health. It appears that parents who are more engaged in discussing eating and physical activity behaviors with children, where the children have the ability to participate in making decisions for the family as well as themselves, seem to be the style that has the best impact. So to me, that's partnership parenting. I can't even believe this is in mainstream news. I'm so excited about this. Dr. Daniels said this, and he's a professor and chairman of pediatrics at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. The higher obesity risk among kids with authoritarian parents may be in part the kids responding negatively to not being able to question things or discuss things. Well, it's happening, folks. A shift is happening in awareness of children's rights and parenting, and to me, that tells me right there that we are on a path of personal growth here in our culture. There's a quote that I love. I want to talk to you about the history of public education. That was told by Mr. John Taylor Gatto, a friend of mine. He endorsed my book, Radical Unschooling, but he is an amazing man. He was a New York City Teacher of the Year for 4 years in a row, and my husband loves his writing. And the book, Dumbing Us Down, was powerful, and I found a great article, a shorter article, obviously, than the book. I don't want to read the whole book to you, but there's a couple of pages here I'm going to read. But I first want to start with a quote, one of my favorite quotes by Katrina Guttelben, and it says, "Learning can only happen if your child is interested. If not, it's like throwing marshmallows at their head and calling it eating." I'll let that sit with you for a while. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. I think forced learning is like bullying. And I think half the problems in today's schools are not only the lack of children's rights, it's the disrespect, it's the focus on obedience, but how on earth can a child be measured on something and graded on something they don't want to learn about? And I think so much that's forced down children's throats are not catered to who they are as an individual, and there's definitely an agenda there. And I want to read more about that. So it's story time, folks. I'm going to read John Taylor Gatto's How Public Education Cripples Our Kids and Why. And the reason why I want to read this is because I talk a lot about alternatives to public school and alternatives to traditional parenting and traditional education. And it's so important for me that you understand the history of why schools came to be, to really, really help unbrainwash yourself as to what you think to be true. I taught for 30 years in some of the worst schools in Manhattan, and in some of the best. And during that time, I became an expert in boredom. Boredom was everywhere in my world. And if you asked the kids, as I often did, why they felt so bored, they always gave the same answers. They said the work was stupid, that it made no sense, and that they already knew it. They said they wanted to be doing something real, not just sitting around. They said teachers didn't seem to know much about their subjects and clearly weren't interested in learning more. And the kids were right. Their teachers were every bit as bored as they were. Boredom is the common condition of school teachers, and anyone who has spent time in a teacher's lounge can vouch for the low energy, the whining, the dispirited attitudes to be found there. When asked why they felt bored, the teachers tend to blame the kids, as you might expect. Who wouldn't get bored teaching students who are rude and interested in only in grades? If even that. Of course, teachers are themselves products of the same 12-year compulsory school programs that so thoroughly bore their students. And as school personnel, they're trapped inside structures even more rigid than those imposed upon the children. Who then is to blame? By the time I finally retired in 1991, I had more than enough reason to think of our schools, with their long-term cell block style, forced confinement of both students and teachers, as virtual factories of childishness. Yet I honestly couldn't see why they had to be that way. My own experience had revealed to me what many other teachers must learn along the way too, yet keep to themselves for fear of reprisal. If we wanted to, we could easily, inexpensively, jetsy in the old stupid structures and help kids take an education further than merely receiving a schooling. We could encourage the best qualities of youthfulness, curiosity, adventure, resilience, the capacity for surprising insight, simply by being more flexible about time, text, and tests, by introducing kids to truly competent adults, and by giving each student what autonomy he or she needs in order to take a risk now and then. Do we really need school? But we don't do that. And the more I ask why not, and persisted in thinking about the problem of schooling, as an engineer might, the more I miss the point. What if there is no problem with our schools? What if they are the way they are, so expensively flying in the face of common sense and long experience in how children learn things, not because they're doing something wrong, but because they're doing something right? Is it possible that George W. Bush accidentally spoke the truth when said we would leave no child behind? Could it be that our schools are designed to make sure no one of them ever grows up? Do we really need school? I don't mean education, just forced schooling. 6 classes a day, 5 days a week, 9 months a year for 12 years. Is this deadly routine really necessary? And if so, for what? Don't hide behind reading, writing, and arithmetic as a rationale, because 2 million happy homeschoolers have surely put the justification to rest. Even if they hadn't, a considerable number of well-known Americans never went through 12-year ringer of our kids that our kids currently go through, and they all turned out all right. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, someone taught them, to be sure, but they weren't products of a school system, and not one of them was ever graduated from a secondary school. Throughout most of American history, kids generally didn't go to high school, yet they unschooled, rose to be admirals, inventors like Edison, captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller, writers like Melville and Twain and Conrad, and even scholars like Margaret Mead. In fact, until pretty recently, people who reached the age of 13 weren't looked upon as children at all. Ariel Durant, who co-wrote an enormous and very good multi-volume history of the world with her husband Will, was happily married at 15. And who could reasonably claim that Ariel Durant was an uneducated person? Unschooled perhaps, but not uneducated. Schools all too often resemble prisons. We have been taught, that is schooled, in this country to think of success as synonymous with, or at least dependent upon, schooling. But historically that isn't true in either an intellectual or a financial sense. And plenty of people throughout the world today find a way to educate themselves without resorting to a system of compulsory secondary schools that all too much resemble prisons. Why then do Americans confuse education with such a system? What exactly is the purpose of our public schools? Mass schooling of a compulsory nature really got its teeth into the United States between 1905 and 1915. Though it was conceived of much earlier and pushed for throughout most of the 19th century. The reason given for this enormous upheaval of family life and cultural traditions was, roughly speaking, threefold. 1, to make good people. 2, to make good citizens. And 3, to make each person his or her own personal best. These goals are still trotted out today on a regular basis, and most of us accept them in one form or another as a decent definition of public education's mission. However short schools actually fall in achieving them, but we're dead wrong. Compounding our error is the fact that national literature holds numerous and surprisingly consistent statements in compulsory schooling's true purpose. We have, for example, the great H.L. Mencken, who wrote The American Mercury for April 1924, that the aim of public education is not to fill the young of the species with knowledge and awaken their intelligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The aim is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same safe level, to breed and train a standardized citizenry, to put down dissent and originality. That is its aim in the United States, and that is its aim everywhere else. Because of Mencken's reputation as a satirist, we might be tempted to dismiss this passage as a bit of sarcasm. His article, however, goes on to trance the template of our own educational system back to the now vanished, though never to be forgotten, military state of Prussia. And although he was certainly aware of the irony that we had recently been at war with Germany, the heir to Prussia, thought and culture, Mencken was being perfectly serious here. Our educational system really is Prussian in origin, and that is really a cause for concern. The odd fact of a Prussian province for our schools pops up again and again once you know what to look for. William James alluded to it many times in the turn of the century. Brownson was publicly denounced the Prussianization of American schools back in 1840. Horace Mann's 7th annual report to the Massachusetts State Board of Education in 1843 is essentially a paean to the land of Frederick the Great, and a call for its schooling to be brought here. That Prussian culture loomed large in America, and is hardly surprising given our early association with the utopian state. A Prussian served as Washington's aide along the military war, the Revolutionary War time, and so many German-speaking people had settled here by 1795 that Congress considered publishing a German language edition for the federal laws. But what shocks the most is that we could so eagerly have adopted one of the very worst aspects of Prussian culture, an educational system deliberately designed to produce mediocre intellects, to hamstring the inner life, to deny students appreciable leadership skills, and to ensure docile and incomplete citizens in order to render the populace manageable. Our educational system is Prussian in origin. It was from James Bryant Conant, president of Harvard for 20 years, World War I poison gas specialist, World War II executive on the atomic bomb project, High Commissioner of the Americanization Zone in Germany in World War II, and truly one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, that I first got wind of the real purpose of American schooling. Without Conant, we would probably not have the same style and degree of standardized testing that we enjoy today, nor would we be blessed with a gargantuan high schools that warehouse 2,000 to 4,000 students at a time, like the famous Columbine High in Littleton, Colorado. Shortly after I retired from teaching, I picked up Conant's 1959 book-length essay, The Child, the Parent, and the State, and was more than a little intrigued to see him mention in passing that modern schools we attend were the result of a revolution engineered between 1905 and 1930. A revolution. He declines to elaborate, but he does direct the curious in the uninformed Alexander Inglis 1918 book, Principles of Secondary Education, in which one saw this revolution through the eyes of a revolutionary. Inglis, for whom a lecture on education at Harvard is named, makes it perfectly clear that compulsory schooling on this continent was intended to be just what it had been for Prussia in the 1820s, a fifth column into the burgeoning democratic movement that threatened to give the peasants a voice at the bargaining table. Modern industrialized compulsory schooling was to make sort of a surgical incision into the unity of the underclasses, divide children by subject, by age grading, by constant rankings on a test, and by many other subtle means. It was unlikely that the ignorant mass of mankind, separated in childhood, would ever reintegrate into a dangerous whole. Inglis breaks down this purpose, the actual purpose of modern schooling, into 6 basic functions, any of which is enough to curl the hair of those innocent enough to believe the 3 traditional goals listed earlier. The adjustive or adaptive function. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. This, of course, preludes critical judgment completely. It also pretty much destroys the idea that useful or interesting material should be taught, because you can't test for reflective obedience until you know whether you can make kids learn and do foolish and boring things. The integrating function, this we might call the conformity function, because its intention is to make children as alike as possible. People who conform are predictable, and this is of great use to those who wish to harness and manipulate a large labor force. The diagnostic and directive function. School is meant to determine each student's proper social role. This is done by logging evidence mathematically and anecdotally on culminative records, as in your permanent record. Yes, you do have one. Break people down and demoralize them, to divide them from one another, and to discard them if they don't conform. Class may frame the proposition, as when Woodrow Wilson, then president of Princeton University, said the following to a New York City School Teachers Association in 1909. We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity, in every society to forego the privileges of a liberal education and fit them in to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. But the motives behind the disgusting decisions that bring about these ends need not be class-based at all. They can stem purely from fear, or from, by now, familiar belief that efficiency is the paramount virtue rather than love, liberty, laughter, or hope. Above all, they can stem from one simple greed. There were vast fortunes to be made, after all, in an economy based on mass production and organized the favor of the large corporation rather than the small business of the family farm. But mass production required mass consumption, and at the turn of the 20th century, most Americans considered it both unnatural and unwise to buy things they didn't actually need. Mandatory schooling was a godsend on that count. School didn't have to train kids in any direct sense to think that they should consume nonstop, because it did something even better. It encouraged them to not think at all, and that left them sitting ducks for another great invention of the modern era, marketing. Now, you needn't have studied marketing to know that there are 2 groups of people who can always be convinced to consume more than they need: addicts and children. School has done a pretty good job of turning our children into addicts, but it has done a spectacular job of turning our children into children. Again, this is no accident. Theorists from Plato Master Rousseau to our own Dr. Inglis, knew that if children could be cloistered with other children, stripped of responsibility and independence, encouraged to develop only the trivialized emotions of greed, envy, jealousy, and fear, that they would grow older but never grow up. In the 1934 edition of his once well-known book of public education in the United States, Elwood P. Coverley detailed and praised the way the strategy of successive school enlargements had extended childhood by 2 to 6 years, and forced schooling was at that point still quite new. The same Coverley, who was Dean of Stafford School of Education, a textbook editor at Houghton Mifflin, and Conant's friend and correspondent at Harvard, had written the following in the 1922 edition of his Public School Administration. Our schools are factories in which the raw products, children, are to be sharpened and fashioned, and it is the business of the school to build its pupils according to the specifications laid down. It's perfectly obvious from our society today what those specifications were. Maturity has by now been banished from nearly every aspect of our lives. Easy divorce laws have removed the need to work at relationships. Easy credit has removed the need for fiscal self-control. Easy entertainment has removed the need to learn to entertain oneself. Easy answers have removed the need to ask questions. We have become a nation of children, happy to surrender our judgments and our wills to political exhortations and commercial blandishments that would insult actual adults. We buy televisions and then we buy things we see on television. We buy computers and then we buy things we see on computers. We buy $150 sneakers, whether we need them or not, and when they fall apart too soon, we buy another pair. We drive SUVs and believe the lie that they constitute a kind of life insurance, even when we're upside down in them. And worst of all, we don't bat an eye when Ari Fleischer tells us to be careful what you say, even if we remember having been told somewhere back in school that America is the land of the free. We simply buy that one too. Our schooling has seen to it. Schools train children to be employees and to be consumers. Now for the good news. Once you understand the logic behind modern schooling, its tricks and its traps are fairly easy to avoid. School trains children to be employees and consumers. Teach your own to be leaders and adventurers. School trains children to obey reflexively. Teach your children to think critically and independently. Well-schooled kids have a low threshold for boredom. Help your own to develop an inner life so they will never be bored. Urge them to take on serious material, the grown-up material in history, literature, philosophy, music, art, economics, theology, all the stuff that school teachers know well enough to avoid. Challenge your kids with plenty of solitude that they can learn to enjoy their own company, to conduct their inner dialogues. Well-schooled people are conditioned to dread being alone, and they seek constant companionship through the TV, the computer, the cell phone, and through shallow friendships quickly acquired and quickly abandoned. Your children should have a more meaningful life, as they can. First, though, we must wake up to what our schools really are. Laboratories of experimentation on young minds. Drill centers for the habits and attitudes that corporate society demands. Mandatory education serves children only incidentally. Its real purpose is to turn them into servants. Don't let your own have their childhoods extended, not even for a day. If David Farragut could make a command of a captured British warship as a preteen, if Thomas Edison could publish a broadsheet at the age of 12, if Benjamin Franklin could apprentice himself to a printer at the same age, then put himself through a course of study that would choke a Yale senior today, there is no telling what your own kids can do. After a long life and 30 years in the public school trenches, I have concluded that genius is as common as dirt. We suppress our genius only because we haven't yet figured out how to manage a population of educated men and women. The solution, I think, is simple and glorious. Let them manage themselves. Now that is one powerful article. It almost brought me to tears at the end there, because I know how true these words are. When I look at my son Devin, I'm still in complete awe of what he does. My kids have all had freedom. They've never been to school, all 4 of them. Devin's almost 15. The things that he creates are amazing. Now, I think some parents really want to know what to do instead of public education or instead of traditional homeschooling. one thing I was talking about in Chicago is that a lot of parents on the path to unschooling tend to let go of everything they know they don't want to do. They don't want to control. They don't want to punish. They don't want to force a curriculum. They don't want to tell their children what to do all day. So they kind of back off and do nothing. And that, I think, is where unschooling kind of gets a bad rep, but it's totally understandable and normal on this path. I think you kind of first let go of what you know you don't want to do, but sometimes it's hard to know what to do in its place. And so I think a lot of parents do go through a period of what we call in parenting, permissiveness, kind of borderline neglect before they know what to replace these things with. So I tell parents not to give up, because that place is not very pleasant either. So what to do instead then? What do you do instead? If you're not interested in being your child's teacher because you know that being a teacher is a role that isn't pleasant if a child doesn't want to be learning what you're forcing down their throat. I don't look at myself as my child's teacher. Instead, I look at myself as my child's learning facilitator. And so what I do is whatever they're interested in, I bring as many resources into their lives as possible to learn and grow from based on their interests. And so we talked about that at one of my sessions, how to facilitate that. What is your child's interest? So think about it. What are your children interested in? No matter what it is, no matter how petty you might think it is, no matter how much you might judge it as being not of value or not as worthy as a school subject. School subjects are something that you've just been conditioned and brainwashed to think are important, math, English, science. But, I mean, you can't have an interest and not touch on all of those things in some way, shape, or form. There was a gentleman in one of my sessions who said that his child was interested in light bulbs. And so I asked the group, let's all brainstorm for a minute on the different things to do with light bulbs. Some people said you could do experiments with them. They could actually take the light bulb apart and see how it works. I read somewhere that you could turn light bulbs into plant holders. You could break part of it and put a plant in it. You could do all kinds of experiments. You can make them into Christmas ornaments. There's so many different things you can do with light bulbs as the nucleus of a child's interest. You can go to a light bulb factory. I think people really underutilize the businesses and the establishments in their area. One thing that we did is we visited our local newspaper. I don't think that there's many tours there, and I think that the people really loved to have us part of it, to show us around the newspaper factory. In fact, if you go to your local newspaper factory, not only will they show you around, but they will let you take the ends of the newspaper rolls that they don't use, and you could bring it home and use them for art projects for free. We take the newspaper rolls, the ends of the rolls from our local paper every week, and Joe uses them for packing materials for our toys. We have our business is making wooden toys, big wooden toys. Joe makes wooden kitchens and play stands and dollhouses and castles, and instead of buying packing material, we use that. So it's kind of recycling and more environmentally friendly, and they're free. So, I mean, who can argue with that? More of a profit. So talking about using your child's interest as the nucleus of their learning is so important, because although we don't break life down into subjects, if you were to break our life down into subjects, you would see that their interests do touch on all these traditional subjects and then some. I think our culture definitely views the authoritarian paradigm as ideal, and that regulation and control are somehow really positive, virtuous traits. But again, you've been really brainwashed into conditioned to think that's so by those that wish to control you. I think it's injustice and abuse to control another person. I don't find it virtuous at all. And I think a lot of times we hear the term thrown around, self-regulate, that if you give children freedom, they'll self-regulate. But I don't even like to take it that far. My children do not self-regulate, because self-regulation means to make a rule and just follow it yourself. What is much better than self-regulation are choices and balance. And everybody finds their own balance with things without control. It's when you're trying to control things, whether it's something your child is watching or doing. As I've said before, my children have never been punished. And what do you think about? What does that trigger in you when you hear that a child has never been punished? We don't need punishments. I don't punish my husband. I don't punish my mother. I don't punish my friends. What do you do instead? Well, in a partnership dynamic, you talk about things. Doesn't mean you don't share how something might have bothered you or how dangerous something was, but you don't punish, because you need rules You need punishment to enforce rules. So again, we don't live by rules. We live by principles. And principles are something that internally motivate the individual, where rules are something that externally force somebody to obey or do something somebody else thinks is proper or right. Where I really want my kids to form their own beliefs and to be internally motivated to do what they feel is best, to do what they feel is good and right. And I think people assume that if children aren't controlled, that they're going to be total brats and spoiled. I was listening to that just today, actually. I was on somebody's page on Facebook, and they posted, do you make your children do anything? And I know this person. I know where they were getting at. They were just curious as to the beliefs of the people on their group. And most people would say yes, of course. Children would not make good choices. They would be spoiled and they would be brats if they weren't controlled and forced to do things. And I always feel like, I want to write a novel every time I see something like this, but it's a little frustrating. You can only really pick and choose your battles, but the truth is this is not the case. I think a lot of times most people haven't heard an option of trusting kids, because when children are given trust and freedom, they make really good choices. And when you're not in a dynamic of the authoritarian paradigm and you're not the wall standing between you and your child's desires, you have this trust built between you where your kids listen to what you say, not in an obedience way, but they listen. They respect you because you respect them. And what you say, they believe. They turn to you as like a trusted resource, for example. I know before we go in, when my kids were younger, actually, before we'd go into a store, I would say before we went in, this isn't a place to run around, that people are shopping and you don't want to bump into anybody, so stay close to me. And I would each give them a part of the list, and they appreciated the information that in this location you don't run around, because that's just not what people do there. Because I'm not threatening them, because I'm not trying to control them, I'm just giving them information. I kind of look at it like a foreign exchange student, for example, somebody that came from another country. How would you treat this 16-year-old exchange student if you were supposed to teach them about the culture in our world? Would you punish them and threaten them and tell them to go sit on the naughty step if they did something wrong? Well, no, they're strangers in this culture, and we're there to give them information, and most of the time they'd really appreciate it. Think about if you went somewhere to another country and you didn't know the cultures and customs, and somebody criticized you and looked at you strange, like, ooh, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have shown the bottom of your shoes. In some Arabic cultures, showing the bottom of your shoes is extremely offensive. But can you imagine if you sat down and crossed your legs and accidentally did that? And imagine if somebody came up and punished you and dragged you away and threw you on a naughty step. How apt would you be to respect that cultural belief, as opposed to someone leaning over and being like, hey, that's not really cool to do here. It's offensive to some people. If you were treated respectfully, you would be so happy with respecting that. But the second someone tries to control you and punishes you and uses meanness and cruelty to get you to do something, your instant human reaction is pushing up against that and rebellion. You're like, F you, I'll show the bottom of my shoe anywhere. I'll kick you right in the head with it. It instantly provokes violence and anger. The same thing is true with children, no matter what the age. I'm amazed with how poorly children are treated in our culture. Yesterday we were somewhere, and there was a little boy, and he must have been around Ivy's age. And I was listening to the adult around him trying to control him. But he did so in such a mean, degrading way. I've seen the boy over and over again, and I see that he's really kind of bored with what he's doing, and he's just trying to keep himself busy. And he's in an area where there's lots of girls and there's no buddies to play with, and he's constantly being yelled at and controlled by a gentleman that's there and telling him, that's not where that goes, put it over there, and just giving him orders. I can't even, if you talk to another adult the way that most adults talk to kids, they would laugh at you. That would be intolerable. You'd never think of treating an adult with that kind of disrespect. Well, the boy kind of sulked away, and I kind of taken it as just a calling or whatever to go over and talk to him. And I said to him, I'm sorry that guy was treating you kind of mean. I just want you to know that I know that wasn't very nice, and you deserve more respect than that. And he looked up at me with these eyes. And I think that sometimes, I don't know if you guys can think back to a time where an adult validated your pain or validated the injustice in your life. But when that happens, it's so powerful. I remember him looking up and he kind of smiled and he just kind of walked off. But I know that sometimes just by telling a child that you understand it's painful, you can't do anything about it for them, but you get it. You agree. Their inner being is correct. That was mean and it was unjust, and he deserved more respect than that. I think that's sometimes all we can do is offer kids our understanding. So I think you can be an advocate just by doing that, by just a smile sometimes. I see parents sometimes in the grocery store treating children really angrily. And it's really easy to kind of get in a judgmental mentality about it and start to judge them. And there's been talk on I have a parenting wellness group on Facebook, and people have posted questions such as, oh, I see this mother on the playground treating this child awfully, and I still want to go tell her off. And I think that's the first response when you start learning about injustice. When the veil is lifted and you start seeing kids as people and not as some kind of subordinates, you see injustice everywhere. And it can be so painful when you first kind of step into it, because all of a sudden everywhere you turn, where there's parents and children, you can see disrespectful talk. You feel really evolved and you want to kind of shed the light on other people, but you're still on the path of evolution yourself, and you still tend to be a little bit authoritarian in how you want to handle things. And so it's definitely not modeling a peaceful dialogue by telling a parent off. I know sometimes you can't help it. I know part of the path of growth is that recognizing of injustice, but also knowing that people learn from modeling and not from being told what to do. So when you kind of telling off another parent, or maybe your parents, or the child's grandparents, I learned the hard way that control doesn't work with my mother-in-law, for example. So I think that you just have to be kind and peaceful and understand that everybody's doing the best they can with what they know at the time, and not everybody is in that awareness that you are. And by just helping the parent out, maybe if they're angry, is the best way to help the child at the time. So asking if you can help with something, and instead of getting really offended. There was a fellow advocate of mine last year. I went to the lake, and she was a very angry woman. She made a difference in the lives of other people, but she was definitely stopped short when it came to children's rights. And I know she was so well-intentioned, so my heart goes out to her with love, but she would walk along the beach just looking for abuse, just looking for injustice or disrespect. And if a parent showed it to a child, she would go right up and tell them off. Now, this is part of the evolution. I get it. Violence is sometimes used to stop violence, but I think that my listeners can take it one step further and realize that if they've done that in the past, that was one step to growth, and now it's time to take it to the next level and open your heart to understanding to every parent, regardless of what they're going through, because you know what? They were kids themselves and more than likely abused, way worse. That parents that are hurting kids are hurt kids themselves. So I think having empathy and love for your fellow parent can be the best role model of anything else. One thing I love about the life that we're living is the process of deschooling. And it can take years and it can look different in every family. But I think kids come to this life pretty easily, depending upon how long they were controlled and how long they were in the institution. Depends on how long they should deschool. I've heard a rough estimate of a month of deschooling for every year a child was in school, and what that is defined as is allowing the child to do whatever they want, giving them total freedom, and that sometimes will look like they're doing nothing at all. They're sitting and playing video games or watching TV all day, just totally decompressing. And if a child has been in school 6 years, allow 6 months of that. I mean, I think you know your child best, and if you're in partnership, you can work with them as far as that's concerned. But it's the parents that really have to do the inner work more than children. Children just naturally want to be free. They naturally have such a strong sense of autonomy, and children naturally want to learn. But, I mean, as I've talked about before, forced learning really damages the process of learning. So there's going to be a little learning curve there for children to learn how to learn again. And one of the best ways that children can learn that learning never ends, and learning is supposed to feel good, is that you continue to learn yourself. When I was talking to one of my groups in Chicago this past weekend, I asked in a full standing room only group of people listening to my session, who here was forced to attend the session? Well, a couple wives turned and looked at their husbands and kind of pointed and snickered, and I said to them, well, you are going to come out of this experience learning 90% less than people that are here by choice. And the whole room kind of laughed. And I said, because if you don't want to be learning about this, you're not going to be focused on what I'm saying. If I told you were going to be tested on it, then you might be a little more intent to listen if you're going to be punished if you didn't do well. However, more than likely you're going to be thinking about what you're going to be doing later. So that kind of opened people's eyes to forced learning is not true learning. Forcing someone to memorize something or else they're going to be punished is not learning. The only way a human can truly learn something, and learning is such a personal thing. The freedom of your mind is as basic as any kind of human right. It's the most basic of human rights, and it's usually the most offended upon in schools. But freedom of mind is such an important aspect of my children's lives. I would never think of testing or quizzing them. I don't think anyone ever really thinks of poking and prodding in a children's mind as offending their basic human rights, but it is. Nobody has the right to find out what's in your mind. That's your personal, private, inner world. That's your life, and your learning is completely your business. Now think about that for a minute. Your learning is your business. That's nobody else's. And how offensive is it that we're constantly poking and prying and testing and quizzing in these children's minds? Some people have called it mind rape. I know that's pretty intense of a term, but to me, I think it's pretty accurate. Reprioritizing is one of the aspects of this life that I am so proud about, because we're so sold so much that we just buy and swallow, like family first, a family meal on TV. Family first. You are so brainwashed to think that that's what our culture is doing. You are forced to put the institution before your family when your children are in school. Even when you're forced to force a curriculum upon your kids with traditional homeschooling, you're still putting an institution and a state before your family. I love, love, love. The biggest rebellion to our culture, and its common thought, is that we are truly putting family first. I would never think to ask permission from an institution to take my child out and be with them. I can't even fathom doing that. I forget sometimes that our culture is so steeped in thinking that's okay, so steeped in this control and just being okay with it. I'm sure somewhere it must feel so wrong. It must feel so upstream to need to call a school to ask permission to keep your child out, or you're threatened with punishment. Don't you realize how unfree that you really are? And I love that we have the freedom to do anything we want, anytime we want. The other level of freedom that I love to take people on and really look at is unjobbing. What I mean by unjobbing is not working for somebody else, not making somebody else money. Why would you make somebody else money? I know that sometimes there is no option, and I totally understand that. However, you can make money off of your passions and interests. That's one thing that my children are already doing. I think that's so natural. Devin, I've talked about Tiffany's pet sitting business. I've talked about Devin's Etsy store. My children know that when they love doing something, they can make money off of it. Devin is making a lute, which is this guitar. And I posted it on my Facebook page with it like half done, and I already have like 3 or 4 messages of people that want one. And then other messages when he loves doing it. He loves woodworking. He loves blacksmithing. He loves these things. He is already more set with a very, very fine-tuned skill, or many skills actually, to sustain his life. Now I know he'll continue on growing, and who knows what he'll be doing. But I think that's another aspect of it. When people say to kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? I think it's almost saying that that's it. You choose one thing and that's what you're doing for the rest of your life. What do you want to be? I have changed careers, professions. I have evolved and grown my whole life. You're not supposed to pick one profession or one career and stick with it. That's so unnatural because you change so much. Every 6 years, you're a completely different human being anyway. Every cell in your body has changed within 6 years. It's so normal to continue to grow and make money off doing different things. And if you're in a job that you don't like, really consider. I love brainstorming with people, actually doing parenting coaching and then career coaching. People call me and we brainstorm together. What do you love to do? How can you make money off of it? With the internet nowadays, between Etsy, eBay, you can make stuff. There's eBay businesses alone. You can go to yard sales come this spring and you could make a fortune off buying things cheap and reselling them. You can have so much more freedom than you realize. If you need to answer to a boss, if you need to punch in, you are so conditioned for that role. I understand that there's professions that's not the case where you went to school for a very long time, and that's even harder to get out of. If you're somebody who really wanted to please the adults around you and you were labeled as gifted and you went on to be a lawyer or you went on to be a doctor, it can be so much harder to get out of that profession because, for one, all the money invested in it. I mean, do you know that being a doctor is like one of the number one rates of suicide? It's such a dangerous profession. It's not a happy profession. I interviewed somebody, a potential speaker for a conference of mine who was a lawyer. She lived in Denmark, and her whole family were lawyers, and she went to school for 8 years and, invested a fortune and then became a lawyer and said, I am really not happy. She realized after all that time how unhappy she was, that she had just been doing what everyone before her had done. And she truly wanted to be a painter, and she wanted to be a dancer. And she never listened to herself. I think we just so blindly have been some of us are so easily conditioned. And some people, I think kids make the best of things. It's kind of a survival mechanism for all mammals, that you just make the best of things. So I hate when people say, oh, my child, I'm fine. I went through school and I'm fine. Or my child, even though they hate going to this class, once they're there, they seem fine. They seem happy. Just because your child's making the best out of a situation and their optimism hasn't been squashed out of them does not mean they're fine. It means that they're conditioned easier and easier and easier. And they learn their values based on the adults around them being pleased with them and how well they obey. How many of us are walking through life still healing through being so screwed up with self-esteem issues because we were told that we were only good, we were only acceptable when others were pleased with us, and they were pleased with us when we met their needs. When we were obedient, we were good, and then we had permission to love ourselves. So it wasn't until other people told us our goodness, it wasn't until we got those A's on those papers, it wasn't until we got those gold stars that we were told, now you're good, now I love you, so now you can love yourself. And love was so conditional. How many damn times have you heard the term unconditional love? Our culture does not live by that. We are the nation of hypocrisy, and I know many of my listeners know that already. Unconditional love. You know how conditional love is in our culture? The authoritarian paradigm is the epitome of unconditional. Conditional love. Unconditional love is unheard of. Unconditional love is responding to your children with love regardless of how they're asking and how they're responding. You unconditionally love them through and unconditionally respond with love. It's not praising obedience and putting down free thought. It is celebrating their differences, checking yourself when you react in ways that you're not proud of. I know as a parent, it's like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, because we're kind of pioneers doing this. I know that the parents that are with me on this path through partnership parenting, we're literally paving new ways. We're paving new paths that have never really been forged before. And it's really hard when you're so conditioned and raised a different way. If you're not at your best, if you're tired or hungry, it's so hard not to be reactive and step back in the way you were parented and respond to your child in a way that you're not proud of. But that's so essential. I work with parents and they tell me that they feel guilty about yelling or treating their child less than respectfully. I think that's kind of one of the growing pains parenting this way, is like you have so much guilt when you see maybe how you treated your child in the past, or when you just are having a hard time being at your best and you treat them in a way that you're just so upset with yourself at. And I just think that guilt is really non-productive. It's so essential to feel how you don't want a parent to really propel you forward and how you do want a parent. I think that guilt eats you up and it brings more things in your life to be guilty about. I think it's just a place that you want to just let go of and forgive yourself. I think a lot of really highly sensitive people parent this way, and we extend this amazing forgiveness and love and understanding to our children, but we kind of stop there and don't extend it to ourselves. This is about reparenting yourself. It's about healing from the past. It's about not trying to hold on to resentment because our parents did the best they could with what they knew at the time. I think every generation probably parents a little bit better and a little bit better. And I know that it was part of how I was parented with these choices I've made. I was never punished. I was never forced to do chores, yet I cleaned and I liked to clean. My mother really modeled a lot of this for me on some levels. She didn't know that there was any option about school. I can remember I was being really bullied in junior high. And this girl was telling me that I had 10 chances. And once I hit number 10, she was going to beat the shit out of me. And I can remember not even really knowing who she was and her yelling across the cafeteria, "That's 2, you looked at me," and just feeling this absolute terror because I didn't even know what I was doing to upset her. And I remember telling my mother, bawling, I don't want to go to school. I'm already on 5 and I'm halfway there and she's going to kill me. My mother crying and saying, "I wish there was something I can do. There's nothing I can do to help you. I'm really sorry. I have no choice. I'll go to jail if I don't send you to school." And I remember asking her to please call the school, and she said that she would try, but I think she had issues with standing up for herself. And so it's like this historic legacy of helplessness. Well, I can just remember empathizing. I don't remember getting mad at her. I remember feeling bad that, well, that sucks that you have no rights and you can't even help me. Well, somehow, something tragic happened actually, and a mutual friend of ours died. Me and this young girl died, and it kind of ended the tyranny on my life because the focus was on this, and she wasn't mean to me after that for whatever reason. And, that ended, but you guys can probably, half of you listening, you can relate to a story like that. And for those of you that think that toughens you up and that's good for children, again, you're disillusioned. You're completely disillusioned to think that cruelty does anything but breed cruelty. It doesn't. It makes you neurotic. It makes you fearful. It makes you into a person that you don't want to be. Control and fear cause cheating, lying, stealing. It turns you into a person that's not who you are by nature. And that is also what schools do. That's what any kind of the authoritarian parenting paradigm turns people into people that they don't want to be, when your basic nature is kindness, love, and just wanting autonomy to be who you are. So I think that those of us pioneering this path are doing a great service for our children, who I'm sure will have their own issues, but they're not going to be nearly as hard as those of us straddling two paradigms, because there's times where I think some moms, for example, or some dads, but one partner is on board before the other. Most of the time it's moms, but most recently I've met a lot of dads, like I've mentioned before, these awesome anarchist dads who I just love. They are so on this path even before the women. And I think it's because, politically, when you're in that mindset, you really get this. You really get it quickly and you get it easily, how schools really are a mini microcosm of the whole idea of control with our government. I like to share that our partners, we need to extend the same philosophy to them. I always tell people to not focus on their children's behavior. That's what our culture does. We try to control one another by controlling behavior. 99% of parenting books on the market are focused on controlling behavior, punishing behavior, manipulating behavior. They call it behavior modification. How selfish and how narcissistic is it to only be focused on somebody's behavior and not focused on the needs under the behavior? Why is a person acting this way? Why is this child in this behavior? And we wonder why narcissism is so prevalent in our culture. We say it's from not being strict enough. It's from kids being spoiled. It's such a disillusioned state. It's from being told to control other people, and to control their behavior. And when you say that my needs are the only ones that matter, and that includes you, that's the main thing, is for you to be obedient and compliant to me, so my needs are met. Well, there's nothing more narcissistic as that in this life, the partnership dynamic. But people don't know. I totally get that you are conditioned yourself to think of parenting in that role, that your role is to condition this child to control their behavior. And when they please you, they are rewarded. When they don't please you, they're not. But whoever takes into consideration children and their needs, that's one of my missions, because I think it comes down to basic children's rights, that their needs matter. And when you focus on the needs under a child's behavior, instead of trying to control them, you become their partner in life and help them get what they want. It does not cause children to be spoiled. It models for them that everyone's needs matter, not just your own. If a child's raised that way, they grew up thinking only their needs matter, and power rules, and you're meant to make everybody around you obey you and control other people. Children learn through modeling. And this is truly what's happening in our culture. So a partnership paradigm is demonstrating that everyone's needs matter equally. It's not that just the child's needs matter. No, your needs matter too. It's so important to learn how to take care of your own needs instead of forcing other people to meet them for you. When you model for a child that everyone's needs matter, yeah, it takes more time. You got to sit down as a family. You got to figure it all out. It's like a critical thinking issue. You really have to find ways to find win-win situations for everyone in your family, and it can be done. Trust me. If you would have told me this 15 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you, but I'm living it. I have 4 children, and it works. We do not have spoiled brats. We have children who are amazingly empathetic and loving individuals. Yeah, they're just like any kids. They fight like siblings, but they care about each other, and they care about other people's needs. If you could come to a conference, and by the way, I'm doing a conference, and I do a conference every year called the Life Rocks Conference. And this year, it's going to be June 2nd through the 5th in Madison, New Hampshire. I'm putting it on. My family's putting it on. And we have some sessions where we talk about connection over control. We talk about alternatives to punishment. We talk about the very basics of unschooling. We have people here that attend my conference that have children in school that want a freer life, and I help them with that. This is a family vacation event. It's for children. We do all kinds of fun activities based on the kids' interests. We do science activities. We do just fun zombie hunts. We do all kinds of cool things. We actually have a Minecraft session usually every year, but it is amazing. So you have to check it out if you want to see if it's something you'd be interested in. If you visit liferocksconference.blogspot.com, you will find out more information. I've just started taking registration for that, and we'd love for your family to attend. We only have it limited to 70 families, so I'm sure it'll go quick. But I think when you surround yourself with other people and you see that so many different people are doing this, that it's not just for hippies and it's not just for radical people that you're thinking have blue hair and look crazy. I mean, yes, everybody's there from all different backgrounds, but we also have doctors, we have lawyers, we have every type of person you can imagine, all in this amazing melting pot of freedom, coming together and supporting each other on this path. And I think community is really essential for a lot of reluctant partners. I know the first conference my husband ever went to many, many years ago, he was like, I really get it. Like, I understand this type of thing now, hanging out with people talking about it, seeing how they're talking to their kids, because you can hear me talk about this philosophically and get it, but to see it applied is a whole different thing. You really need to see it in action and see how parents speak to their kids. I found that so immensely helpful all those years ago, and I love being around other people who treat their kids with respect. If you're somebody who's still parenting in an authoritarian dynamic, don't worry. The empathy for you there is extended. People understand that everyone's in a different place in their path, and if you don't know what to do, instead of controlling, that's understandable. No one's going to give you dirty looks. I think people get really nervous at conferences if they're new to the scene, because they worry about parenting their children or sounding controlling or punishing or something in front of other parents. But the truth is, just be yourself, and people are going to help you and support you no matter where you are on your path. So I really encourage you. I live in New Hampshire, Madison, New Hampshire, to come to the Life Rocks Conference, June 2nd through the 5th. It's 2 full days, 1 night of fun. So those of you listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe to my channel and thumbs up this video. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you next week.